and bacteria are actually very different organisms. And their infections are spread, treated, and they continue to kind of grow in the body much differently, so they have to be treated much differently. Which is why today I'm going to explain the difference between viruses, bacteria, and their infections. So first, viruses. Viruses are actually non-living organisms. They're not actually alive. So they can't replicate on their own. In fact, that they can't replicate means they actually, in order to replicate, they actually have to take over a host cell. So there are actually two types of viruses. There are DNA viruses and there are RNA viruses, depending on the type of genetic information that they use to replicate or take over a host cell. So in order to actually replicate, viruses actually what they do is they'll take over a host cell and they'll actually inject their DNA into it and kind of effectively zombify this host cell. This host cell will then basically become kind of a virus factory, and it'll create viruses, as you can see in those second and third images. And it'll actually create viruses internally until the cell actually bursts. And once the cell bursts, it releases more viruses back into the body, and the process is repeated. Now, not all viruses actually replicate in this manner. Some actually don't replicate, and actually instead of causing the host cell to create more viruses, actually cause the host cell to become cancerous and then infect other cells with cancer. Now, most viruses actually cause disease, and they actually will only attack a specific type or types of cells. Viral infections actually can't be treated. They can actually only be prevented through the use of vaccinations and such. Antibiotics don't work against them, which is why it's very important to distinguish between a virus and a bacteria, because if you use antibiotics on a viral infection, it actually won't work. There's actually some antiviral medication that is used for the more common viruses like the flu, but they actually have been shown to lead to kind of the creation of drug-resistant microbes, which is why most viral infection treatments actually only treat the symptoms, and they just allow the body to then kill the virus. So now on to bacteria. Bacteria they're actually living organisms. They're complex single-celled structures with a rigid cell wall and a thin rubbery membrane surrounding the fluid inside the cell, all according to WebMD. They actually can reproduce on their own. They're reproduced through a process called binary fission. It is where the main cell or parent cell actually splits into two identical daughter cells. It actually does this process by first replicating the internal DNA. Then the cell itself actually elongates, and that will actually cause the cell to split into two, and that will create two identical daughter cells. Now, most bacteria actually are harmless, and some actually are helpful to the body in terms of helping things like fighting disease, aiding in digestion, fighting cancerous cells, and even kind of giving our body some essential nutrients. Now, the reason bacteria infections are different is because they can be treated with antibiotics. And the reason antibiotics work by actually going into the body and affecting the bacteria and basically making it so the cells of bacteria can't function and eventually die. Now, humans are actually resistant to this are actually immune to antibiotics because antibiotics only affect prokaryotic cells, which are the type of cells that bacteria are. So now, it's very important to distinguish between cells and bacteria mostly because of the way they're treated. They're completely different organisms. Viral infection treatments normally involve treating the symptoms. Bacterial treatments normally involve actually killing the bacteria itself, which is why we're going to move on to what Shen has to say.